can use this one. Okay.
Well, I'm going to need one for questions.
You guys need this cable out? No. I'm gonna go and take that.
Oh, I'm good. How are you doing?
I'm pretty good.
Thank you.
Okay, here, I'm going to do it. Otherwise, I'll start making up stuff.
How's the worst thing that's ever happened?
I don't know. I still like the Henry plant. You know, you've heard the legends, the truth is better.
Yes.
Mantra.
It's supposed to be true.
I did have access to their records too when I wrote my first term paper. Oh yeah, they let me have the pictures on cover my tourism term paper because they come out and they're so excited somebody actually asked. 1516. Is this on?
No stand? Okay. Thank you, Tim. Good morning, everybody. There's the microphone for questions. So this class is a fireside chat with Leslie Keys. So I've got kind of a chronological order of questions, and mostly what we want to do is try to clear up some of the common questions that we get about Henry Flagler and his impact on St. Augustine, and even with the church. And we'll talk for a little while, we'll go back and forth. I'll lead Leslie down the yellow brick road to Oz. And then at the end, we'll have questions from you guys. So hopefully you'll have questions of your own, or maybe we might answer some of those to begin with. So one of the common questions that we get about Henry Flagler is about his origins. Family life. People don't know a lot about his father, usually a little bit less about his mother. So Leslie, can you talk a little bit about his background and how he got to Bellevue at the age of 14 working for the Harkness family?
Sure. Oh, that worked. Okay. Yes, and you can see Jay did give me a homework assignment, so I have done all my crib notes here too. And I will tell you that just as a start out, and I do refer to Henry in first person because we've had a relationship since at least 1981 when I came here. But I worked in Ohio, so I've been to Bellevue, which is south of Sandusky, if that helps. You have to put this in context too. 14 was not a young age at that time for especially males to be treated as men. So being out in the working world wouldn't have been that unusual. In middle school now, we would probably question the rationality of that. But Flagler, and also Isaac Flagler, who was Henry's father, was itinerant Presbyterian minister, so he traveled. Henry's grandfather was also a Presbyterian minister. Henry's mother was Isaac's third wife, Eliza Caldwell Morrison Harkness Flagler, which is where you get a lot of those names and cousins and siblings that pull him across from upstate New York, where he was born, north of New York City, west to Ohio. Also, think at the time of the 19th century and the development of the states. We're sort of past developing New England, but we are very much working on the Midwest and heading to the West. So the opportunities would have been greater there. So,
and the Morrison part, it was Henry Morrison Flagler which I found that kind of ironic that his middle name came from his mother's previous husband.
Yeah, the first one, which was Morrison. The
Yes,
second one,
yes.
Harkness.
Yes.
The third one was Flagler. So she used all three names, and I haven't done enough research to know whether that was real common or not, but it seemed that they are it's a yours, mine, and ours blended family. Let's put it that way, too. And I think the only other, let's see, the rest of the Flagler family, it wasn't like they also left Henry in Ohio by himself. He certainly was there with his cousins and half-siblings, but his parents ended up moving to Toledo, Ohio, too. And in case you're interested, that house is still standing. It's a rental house in Bellevue, and they do have a historical marker there, and
that's
the Ohio History Center, which I worked for from 1979 to 83, did an interview a few years ago for Henry's death anniversary, and actually came down here and taped, and then used the connections between Henry and John D. Rockefeller.
in the house you're talking about is his parents.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, because Flagler's home is actually no longer standing. When Flagler lived in Bellevue, Ohio, he had a beautiful, they called it the gingerbread house, because it had it was brick, had a lot of details, gingerbread details around it. When Flagler moves to Cleveland with Standard Oil, the house is bought by Stephen Harkness, probably as, hey, I'm staying here, you're moving, I'll buy your house for you. Incidentally, I think Stephen is the one that built the Congregational Church that's right next to where Flagler's house stood. And that church is still there in Bellevue. It's a beautiful church. It's closed, and you can't go in it, which is unfortunate because it's a beautiful, beautiful church. But so once Flagler moves to Cleveland, Stephen lives in the house, and it ends up becoming the YMCA for Bellevue, Ohio. So a lot of students, or a lot of kids, learn how to swim at the Flagler's, which is kind of bizarre, which of course Flagler ends up building a YMCA here in St. Augustine, which was where the tennis courts were for the FEC employees. So lots of strings going everywhere.
Well, and we'll come up to that in a little later when we talk about Franklin Smith, because he liked the YMCAs, and that was a big interest of his as well.
Okay. And Flagler's, Leslie mentioned this, Flagler's family, or Flagler's father and mother moved to Bellevue, and that is where they are, or were, interred. Flagler's middle daughter, Carrie, dies while they're in Bellevue. And so I've always wondered why they left Carrie when they moved to Cleveland, and then they moved eventually to New York. And the New York, of course, in cemetery, Woodlawn? Woodlawn Cemetery in the Bronx is where the Flagler plot was. Harry and his family and his Aunt Caroline are buried there in Woodlawn. They're not obviously buried here in St. Augustine. Why did they not move Carrie with them? And that was because Flagler's mother and father were buried there. They never knew that. Gene Flagler Matthews comes along much later and has them moved to the Flagler Cemetery in upstate New York. And so they are no longer buried there in Bellevue. Carrie is now literally the only Flagler relative still there. But she wanted the Flaglers moved to the family cemetery. So what Gene Flagler Matthews wants, Gene Flagler Matthews gets. So from that time point where he comes to Bellevue, he becomes involved with the Harkness family, which were his half-brothers and sisters and cousins and all that. Very thick family connection. The family is doing very, very well with their mercantile business. Flagler was a clerk in the store, slept under the counter of the store for much of his life, and then becomes involved with his first cousin. Was Mary first? Mary Harkness? Mary Harkness becomes his betrothed, his first wife. And so that's when Flagler builds his home there in Bellevue. And the intention there is obviously that they're going to stay there in Bellevue. but that's not how it works out, correct? Yeah. I know, it would be boring. We wouldn't be in here. And then from there, he goes and gets involved with a grain merchant from Ohio named J.D. Rockefeller. So let's talk a little bit about how the Standard Oil thing came about.
Well, you're in the midst of the 19th century, time of the Civil War, actually, and just this might be useless trivia, but just so you know, nobody that we're going to talk about today probably actually fought in the Civil War. You could pay $200 at the time, which would be a lot more now, but you could pay $200 and have somebody else fill your shoes, literally, and suit in the service. So John D. Rockefeller and Henry Flagler end up in Cleveland together on Euclid Avenue, which is a very preeminent street. They have elaborate French Empire, Second Empire houses. They become extremely close friends, and there are lots of writings about this where you'd see them strolling down the street together, walking to work. They, again, lived near each other there, as they would go on to do on Fifth Avenue in New York. They had desks sitting opposite each other, so they sat across from each other all day, every day. I would say the Mrs. Flagler and Mrs. Rockefeller weren't quite as close from stories, but Mrs. Rockefeller was very, very secure in her convictions, and they were very, what today I would say are extremely conservative on the way people should behave. Now, also, neither one of them shared an interest in alcohol, and the reason I bring that up is because grain wasn't just used for what you might think it was, but a whole lot of grain was used to make liquor. So neither one of them participated in drinking that, but they certainly were involved in a business that fostered that action as well. And they had sons at the same time. You have Harry Harkness Flagler, John D. Rockefeller. You get 1, 2, 3, and 4. In case you did not know, all of them except John D. the Fourth have been here to St. Augustine. So, so you have them raising their kids at the same time as well.
So that, just the connection between the two men is very interesting, and that continues on really throughout Flagler's life. When Flagler purchases the Hotel Ormond, he basically, I would say, more than doubles the size of the hotel. It's a very popular hotel just to the south of Daytona. And so Flagler takes advantage of that and increases the capacity quite a bit. But it just so happened that J.D. Rockefeller liked staying in that hotel, and he would rent an entire floor, which must have been nice. But, he noticed, this is one of the stories, that the cost of getting the entire floor kept going up every year, and so he eventually decides, well, I'm not going to pay for this, I'm going to just buy a house. So he buys the casements, which is still there today, and you can tour that as a museum. And it's right near where the Hotel Ormond used to be. There's a cupola that's left of the hotel, and that's it. But it's worth, if you have a chance to go into it's a little museum inside the cupola. If you have a chance to go in there, it's very, very good. But obviously, and I don't know if you know this, but Ormond is where NASCAR began, basically Daytona and Ormond.
Driving on the beach.
In the garage of the hotel. So that's where they built the engines and cars and all that stuff. So,
well, and,
yeah.
I have been here, there, and everywhere, as I warned you. But my first boss in Ohio, his mother was living in the Ormond Hotel. By that time, it was actually a nursing home. But as I came down here to study St. Augustine history, he said, you have to go down to Ormond and see my mom. So he sent me with a care package of materials. she was so excited to have a visitor who liked old buildings that she took me all through the structure, and we knocked on doors. We met all of her friends, all that. So it was hard to see when that was torn down. The condos that are on the north side of Granada Avenue are where the Ormond Hotel was. It was built by two guys from Kentucky. So Flagler and Rockefeller were working that whole Midwest connection and railroads pretty early on, too. And the casements is still there. If you have not seen it, they've done a lot to help reinterpret that as a museum. And small world story, during COVID, when nobody was working, they had hurricane damage and the windows had been blown out. And my other half, Tom McDonald, is a contractor here in town that does a lot of historic preservation. So he restored the windows during COVID because that was a pretty safe thing to do when you're on the outside of a big 3-story building. But I went down then and helped write their reinterpretation so we could bring them up to date on that. So everything comes full circle. You might get 6 degrees of separation if you're Kevin Bacon, but you get about 2 if it's Henry Flagler.
That is the truth. There are a ton of strings that are everywhere. So once they moved to Cleveland, and we talked about Euclid Avenue, neither of the houses are still there. Then they move, obviously, to New York City. Flagler's home, I think, is a Gucci store now. And it was funny because both Flagler and Rockefeller purchased homes in New York. And they were not exquisite mansions like you see with the Vanderbilts or anything like that. They were very plain, which goes completely along with J.D. Rockefeller and his wife's kind of views on things. And Flagler was not ostentatious by any means. And Flagler, when he bought the house, had a very large stable. And Flagler was not really into horses, but J.D. Rockefeller was. And so Flagler just sold the stable to J.D. Rockefeller so that J.D. Rockefeller could keep his horses there, and then Flagler used his garage for his carriages, because they were literally that close, which is bizarre. But anyway, it's the Rockefellers and the Flaglers. We're kind of used to the bizarre. And so Flagler's first wife, Mary Harkness, it's that first trip. Do we have kind of a year for that? 1880-something? No, it's not, because she dies in 81.
Well, but they
It's
come down.
early.
Yeah, she doesn't live very long after. They come down to Jacksonville to stay at what was the St. James, which is the city hall these days in Jacksonville, and then come down
And
here.
the St. James was a very luxurious hotel. St. Augustine did not have one of those yet. And that kind of gives Flagler a not very impressionable view of St. Augustine when he first comes down. But go ahead.
Well, the other thing I was going to say is you had Louis Comfort Tiffany and his wife, Mary, had come down early 1880s. Thomas Edison and his first wife, Mary, came down same time. They're all friends already. It's not this mysterious thing that they became buds when they got to St. Augustine. Tiffany actually paints a couple of scenes down here that he exhibits in art shows. And it's to try to bring St. Augustine out of a very depressed economy after the end of the Civil War, is what all of that attention is doing. Now, tuberculosis, what we call consumption, was a very prominent disease at the time, especially for women. It is where you cannot open up your lungs. Well, if any of you have ever dressed in attire of that time, and once upon a time I was forced into dressing as Mary Lily Flagler in widow's weeds for the Florida legislature in Tallahassee, I can tell you, you cannot breathe. So there's probably a reason they couldn't open their lungs. But all 3 of those women named Mary passed away within months of each other as well. So all 3 men remarried and started, life down here at a different chapter. But it was just sort of an interesting, they all corresponded with each other, and they all had sadness at the same time, too.
And so after Mary Harkness passes away, Flagler remarries to a young lady named Ida Alice Schwartz. AKA the crazy one. And but she was very different, and I think it's very interesting to look at the women in Flagler's world, because all of them are very different. I think Mary Harkness was very much a very demure and proper woman. Ida Alice, I wouldn't say was so proper. She was from a lower class family. Her father was an Episcopalian minister who dies and leaves she and her brother and their mother kind of destitute. So they end up running an inn somewhere in Connecticut, I think. And so they bounce around. But then at some point, she comes into connection with the Flaglers. It was very typical for wealthy women to have a companion, a paid companion. And she would be a young girl from the lower class who would be kind of not a nurse, and that's where I think we get the connotation of nurse and companion mixed up in the Flagler story. She was just a paid companion, so she would have been there to help Mary do whatever she needed to do. Not a maid, but just there, like a personal assistant type thing. And at that point, sometime in that connection, Flagler has an attraction to her, and it's reciprocated, and they end up getting married. And she's described as having a very, like strawberry blonde hair or reddish. It was very unusual. And her eyes were very unusual. They had an intensity to them. And that's what drew Flagler to her, which is very different from what you hear said about Mary Harkness. So let's touch on Ida Alice for just a bit.
Well, and I'm going to throw in a little geographic context first, too, is Mary Harkness was sort of a safe and predictable marriage because of all the other intermarriage within those families in the first place, and you're in Ohio. When they get to New York, life is a little different, faster paced. You're exposed to a lot more variety and culture. Ida Alice is considered to be very theatrical, very dramatic.
Mm-hmm. She was an actress.
Yes, and
which in those days was not considered very high status.
Yes.
We'll leave it at that.
So I am going to speculate, at least from what I've been able to read, is that Henry at the time, too, sort of trusted her because she'd been his wife's companion. And it was normal to remarry. It was normal to have a relationship again. So he and Ida Alice actually, and this is going to lead into the next one, but lest you think that Flagler's and Keenan's started with Mary Lilly, that is not true either. Henry Flagler and John D. Rockefeller had a long-standing business relationship with Keenan Oil, okay? In North Carolina, by the way, one of the Keenans still lives in Lexington, Kentucky, which comes back into that Kentucky and hotel connection. I don't know if he donates here, but every now and then I will get a message from him, and he will ask me a Flagler family question and Keenan question, and we'll do that. So they were, again, developing their Standard Oil interests, and so Ida Alice and Henry actually go to Mary Lilly Keenan's debut. She was born in 1867, so this is when she is 18 years old, and it's an event, and it's because all of the families are friends. So there's nothing dramatic that's going to come later that you will read about in newspapers of the time that sounds quite so horrible. I'll also say that Ida Alice is very... yeah, sorry about that. I'm used to projecting without this. Ida Alice had her own set of interests. She was very flamboyant. She also, I would say, was very vulnerable, partly probably because of the way she was born and raised and her experiences. So she began to get into the late 19th century Ouija board stuff. That is all very true. Now, I will say, probably some of us in this room did that when we were like 12 or 13 years old and thought it was like a fun little game like Parcheesi and Monopoly or something, But at the time that she was doing this is really the way you learned about your future. And part of her fantasies were that Tsar Nicholas II was going to come and rescue her from her current relationship with Henry Flagler and sweep her off her feet and take her away. Now, I'm guessing that everybody in here knows that Tsar Nicholas didn't really have a happy ending, okay? Queen Victoria had certainly married her heirs off to every royal family, but Russia, it didn't work quite so well. So Tsar Nicholas II is assassinated, as his wife and children all are. And apparently the news didn't make it across the water. Ida Alice did go after Henry Flagler with scissors and tried to stab him. He had her institutionalized for a time. She came out of that. She sort of went off on all of that again and had to be institutionalized for a time that's going to last for decades then. But there's been a lot more research on her mental state in recent years, and scholars believe that she had early onset dementia. So we would not, hopefully, make fun of her. I really do pester the students across the street not to refer to her as the crazy woman. Yes. And no, Henry did not, leave her abandoned in the ponds and do weird have her chained up and all this weird stuff, which again is student lore. But
The store at Flagler did create a trust for her, and that trust, when she passes away, was about $10 million in those days.
1934, during
Yeah.
the Depression.
So she outlived
Yes.
everybody. So
We're not sure she knew it.
no, right.
Or she knew where she was, but
And she had two distant cousins that were day laborers. And of course, everybody came out of the woodwork when she died to claim the $10 million. I mean, you'd have to be crazy if you didn't. But there were two farm laborers that were her cousins, and these guys would go from farm to farm in the Midwest and rent themselves out for day labor. They inherit the $10 million. Can you imagine? I would imagine that they had a huge portrait of her in their house, and every time they said grace, thank you, Ida Alice, I don't know who you are, but thank you. Yeah. But, I mean, the irony of all this is very interesting. And so, of course, we come into the Keenan, we're leading into the Keenan connection. And it's very interesting because Leslie was the person that I first heard about Flagler and Ida Alice attending Keenan events and the Joneses, the Pembroke Joneses, keeping up with the Joneses. Those were the Joneses that you were trying to keep up with. The Keenans were very much in the center of Gilded Age society. And the idea was Mary Lily had hit, 30, once you hit around 30 years old, you're pretty much, they give up hope of you ever marrying. And then along comes Henry Flagler. And in the wedding picture, everybody's young, except for Mary Lily's mother and Henry Flagler. And it's like, wow. But you can see her dress, Mary Lily's dress, at Liberty Hall, which is in Kenansville, North Carolina. I went there and I walked into the museum and I said, "Hi, I'm from St. Augustine, Florida." And you would have thought I had risen from the dead or something. And they're like, "Oh, welcome," and they let me, have a picture standing next to Mary Lily's dress.
which is very tiny.
It's
but
very tiny. I was taller than the mannequin. Beautiful dress, and there's a copy of it in Whitehall. They did have a copy of the dress made in Whitehall. So if you go down to Whitehall, you can see, not the original, but it's modeled after the original. But, so along comes Mary Lily Keenan. Not really sure how that relationship develops. Obviously, Ida Alice is out of the picture, and so I think Flagler was looking more for someone to take care of him in his old age. How old was he at this point in time?
Well, if we're at the end of the century, he was born in 1830, so he's 69.
Okay.
which is
About
not that
70,
old
which
these
is not
days.
not that old these days, but back in the Gilded Age,
Yes.
that was old. Um, and so when Flagler marries her, he gives her a number of things, including Whitehall, the Marble Palace in Palm Beach. But he also gives her a string of pearls that is valued at like 100 million? No, it wasn't that much. Like 10 million?
I would say 1 million because
Oh,
everybody
okay.
extrapolates into current day dollars. But
Yes, that's true. That is true. So it was $1 million then. Beautiful strand of pearls,
random.
which Louise ends up inheriting.
Yes.
Yes. But anyway,
Well, the other part of this too, on some of that connection on how they get together, keep in mind that a lot of this is really the first time period, the end of the 19th century, when taking a vacation, leisure time, was a thing. It didn't really happen before that. And you have trains and you have resorts. And Jay teased me a little bit, and I'll probably get the live streaming all messed up, but I did, write a book, and several actually. But this is on the Hotel Ponce de Leon and its preservation. But part of what you have to do is prove all these rumors that you've heard or disprove them. So I found out there were 600 resorts throughout the United States. I own almost every book with almost every resort. And so they would make a pilgrimage as everyone came south for the winter. Fortunately, they didn't have to go on boats anymore since we started building railroads, thanks again in part to Henry, and then across the United States. Well, they all went, before the marriage happened, to this luxury historic hotel now in Asheville, North Carolina, known as the Grove Park Inn. So you can see they still have the registers where they've checked in. So they were all socializing together. And in the summers, they would then take actually the staffs from these hotels and go up to places like Mount Washington and in the White Mountains, where Henry signed his name up there, and some of the stained glass windows were done by the same artisans that did stuff down here. So it's not that we were that isolated, and newspapers that people actually read were published, and people were more literate, they traveled more. So you have that sort of enclave of wealthy people, and you will see them signing the guest register at the Jekyll Island Hotel, leaving Jekyll Island today for the Hotel Ponce de Leon. And then they leave here in February, and they head further south, and they talk about riding on the trains on both directions. So it's not that unusual. It wasn't that, he sort of plucked her out of thin air. They were socializing a lot. And she, even though she was that horrible old age of 30, she was amazingly talented. And yeah, she played the piano and she sang, and so a lot of these, she did a series of performances. She graduated from the Peace Institute, which is now part of a college, so it wasn't just finishing school for girls kind of thing. So yeah, I think intellectually she was an equal with him too.
and incidentally, she comes to St. Augustine when Flagler and Ida Alice are here. She is mentioned in the newspapers as coming to St. Augustine with friends. The Joneses, in fact, when they come to St. Augustine, they bring her here. She sang in Memorial. She performed here before she was married to Flagler. So, yes, it's very thick. And it's really through the Keenan family that the FEC, the hotel company, and all of that continue on after Flagler's passing. Harry had tried to run the hotels here in St. Augustine, and it went for one season. And then Harry said, I'm not into this at all. This is not my thing. And he went up to New York. He ends up founding the New York Philharmonic. He was very involved in art boards. One thing you got to remember about the Gilded Age is this wealthy class of people were called the leisure class. And it wasn't because, once every few months they went on vacation. It was because they literally were on vacation all the time. And just like Leslie said, the staff that worked in the Flagler hotels, down here during the season here would go up to New York in Saratoga Springs
Yeah.
and work up there. So you saw all the same people if you were working in the hotels. If you had that career and you were moving up and eventually becoming the hotel manager, you got to know all of these people. And so no matter where you were or where you were placed, you would run into them. And so our idea that Harry didn't really have a job isn't really unusual for that class of people at that time, because, it wasn't a lot of them were like that. Harry did the really, really smart thing, and he married a very wealthy young lady.
Annie Lamont.
Yes, and there's some stories about the family, but that's another pop-up. Maybe not in a church, but anyway. So Harry does the right thing. He marries a very young woman. He has 3 daughters. All of them are raised to be very proper young ladies. One of them is Jean Flagler Matthews. She was the youngest, correct? And what's interesting, and one thing I want to point out before we run out of time, is that the gardens were given by Jean Flagler Matthews in the 60s in honor of her father, her mother, and then her sisters. All of them were into gardening. In fact, Jean Flagler Matthews has 2 varieties of daffodils that are named for her. So, and her home in Rye, New York was covered in daffodils. So she obviously didn't go out and plant them. She had somebody do that for her and raise them and all of that. But
She appreciated them.
she definitely, the fact that the gardens around the church are given in memory by her is not a ironic thing, or that was the last thing she could give. It was very purposeful.
Well, and I'm going to dive in here on
Okay.
on Harry a minute. In that the same year that Henry asked Harry to come down and manage the hotels here was the same time that John D. Rockefeller asked John D. Rockefeller #2 to do a similar active participation in some of his business ventures. And then he decided real quickly that neither of the sons had any real interest in that. So John D. the Jr. becomes a philanthropist, does a lot of things, building bridges in national parks, buying land for national parks, and investing in Colonial Williamsburg in 1926. But he also runs the Rockefeller Foundation, which is the time income taxes beginning in the nation. All the wealthy started private foundations. I'm sure they were philanthropic, but it was also so they didn't have to pay taxes.
And Flagler dies the year that income tax is enacted. Coincidence?
And Mary Lily, by the way, donates the first tract of land in South Florida for the Everglades that was part of the Flagler land down there. So, yeah.
And Flagler does a lot in St. Augustine. Most of you probably know about Flagler Hospital. It started as the Alicia Hospital. Alicia was Flagler's pet name for Ida Alice. And so he had a yacht named the Alicia, a rail car named the Alicia. Hospital was the Alicia.
It's where the condos are down south
Yes.
on the Bayfront.
On Marine Street.
Yes.
Down there by Bayview. And so it becomes the hospital in St. Augustine. There's also the Railroad Hospital, which is where the police station is today. You had your choice of where you could go, and there are a lot of local kids who were born in the FEC Railway Hospital and that know the doctors that were there. Same thing with Flagler Hospital. When Flagler Hospital burns, was it burning? They demolish it and they build a new hospital. Mary Lily Keenan, after Flagler's death, is the one who donates the money for the hospital that was actually the one down on Marine Street, the most recent
Iteration.
hospital that was there.
Yeah, the first one was wood.
Where I was born.
You were born? Really? Okay.
Yes, in a hospital with asbestos, which makes a lot of sense when people get to know me. At that point, Flagler Hospital changes from Alicia Hospital to Flagler Hospital, because when you have the third wife come in, to a hospital named for the second wife, no, that's not going to work.
The marker for the Alicia Hospital, though, is out at the Flagler Hospital,
Yes, it
the
is.
current one on the grounds of it.
And if you look at the back of that sign, it does say Alicia Hospital. So it's the original sign.
Yeah.
How are we doing on time? Okay, so
Ooh.
questions.
Okay.
Come on now.
Okay. Oh, yes. Okay, so Louise Wise. What is Louise Wise?
Lewis Francis.
Yes. Yeah, well, I mean, we would be here all day. So the question that Mary Catherine was talking about is the rumor that Louise Wise Lewis was Henry Flagler and Mary Lily's child. What happens is Mary Lily goes to the Greenbrier, which is in West Virginia, hotel in
Yes.
West Virginia.
Still
very
there,
popular resort hotel. At the same time, her sister, who is pregnant, comes to the Greenbrier, and that is where Louise Wise Lewis was born. So the rumor circulates that it was actually Henry Flagler and Mary Lily's child, not
Louise Clisby,
yes.
and part of the reason that as she was very pregnant, getting ready to deliver a baby, she was not at home is because her husband was an alcoholic and he was abusive to her. So she ultimately gets out of that situation.
And they lived in Macon, Georgia. Flagler pays for Louise Wise's mother to have a new house in
Yes.
Macon. I don't know where it is. Haven't been able to track that down yet. But that's a connection to Macon, Georgia. I don't know why, but anyway. So I don't think it's true. There is a picture so if you look at the wedding picture from Mary Lily and Flagler's wedding, little Louise Wise is sitting on the stair right next to William Rankinen, I think, and Flagler. So she was there at the wedding. She was the flower girl. That'd be kind of creepy. But there is a really interesting post by the Henry Flagler Museum in Palm Beach of Russell Joy, who was an organist at Whitehall, who was actually an organist here at Memorial. And he's sitting on a couch next to Louise Wise, which I thought was really kind of ironic. But anyway, she appears in all of the Flagler pictures. She was around Flagler and Mary Lily all the time. She grew up around them, so she was very much a part of Flagler and Mary Lily's family. Okay, I'll shut up now. Next question.
Come on. Hey, I finally got this to work, I think.
We're going to pick on Jessica Clark. Do you have a question, Jessica?
Hold on. Let me bring this to you, Jessica.
I was just going to tell you, part of the travels is I have been to Lockport, New York. I have been everywhere that Henry has been. I've been up to Nova Scotia to the Anderson family home. I've been to the site where Henry's hotel is in Nassau in the Bahamas. I have been to Havana, Cuba. So I've followed him around for 45 years or more.
One is, did Ida Alice die here in St. Augustine? Oh, no.
No,
Okay.
she died in New York in a sanitarium. So she was under the care of Dr. Carlos McDonald, who was what they called an alienist back then, but it was basically a psychiatrist. He was the psychiatrist chosen when President McKinley was shot to do an evaluation on the assassin. So he was a very, very well-known medical figure. He ends up dying, and then one of his students takes over the sanitarium, and that's where Ida Alice ends up passing away. She dies in the 1930s. So
Yeah,
she, like I said, she
1934.
outlived everybody.
Yeah.
Did Henry Flagler or his family ever go to church here?
Flagler was here.
He goes
whenever
to church
would
every
worship.
Sunday here.
Yeah. Whether he likes it or not. He
When
does
he
like
was
the
walking.
organ. He does like Matt being the organist because he likes it loud. He always liked the organist to play the pedal and the deep notes because as he got older, he couldn't hear as well, so he could feel the vibration. So that is his pew number 20. If you happen to find $1 million, leave it. I'll be right there. Flagler's Gene Flagler Matthews came here and worked with Dr. Lee, who was the pastor during the major restoration work on the inside of the church, the first real major restoration. And she steals Dr. Lee. Dr. Lee retires from being a pastor here and then goes and works at the Flagler Museum in Palm Beach. And so I wouldn't say that they were always members. Gene Flagler Matthews had a membership here. I don't think they ever really go off the books no matter where they're going to church. You know, it's kind of like, you know, if Harry had gone to Flagler College, he really wouldn't have had to gone to class at all or turn anything in. So it's kind of that situation. Right. But Flagler, I did come across their membership certificate when Henry and Mary Lily both joined Memorial Presbyterian. I did come across their membership certificates in the archives, which was kind of cool.
Building of the church.
So the New York Times has an article announcing the dedication of the church, and they list the cost at $245,000, which comes to about 3.7 million, I think.
Well, considering that the Ponce was built, all 275,000 square feet of it, for $2.5 million, which today is worth about $63 million, assuming you could actually reproduce what's in it.
Right.
So that wasn't, that wasn't an inconsequential amount for the time. Yeah.
The other question is, do we know if any workers were injured during the building?
There is a story that's printed in the St. Augustine Record about a collapse in the building at night. They had some stonework, I guess, got dislodged, and there was a big crash in the sanctuary, but no. As far as I know, there is no injuries. There's a story that gets printed right after Flagler dedicates the church that he invited all of the workers and their families to North Beach, which would have been Volano, for a picnic. And so he paid for that for all of their families to go over and have a good time on him, basically. And that was mainly because they had met the deadline that he had set for them.
Anyone?
So that's, well, no.
He's
That's
asking
when
if
it starts
500
getting
people
fuzzy,
worked day and night.
and people like to, well, you know, he was working them day and night. They didn't work day and night. They had a crew of about 250 to 300 men that were working on the church. So one of the things about the construction crew, these were the same construction crew that worked on the Ponce. Then they went across the street and started working on the Alcazar. The Alcazar to this day is still unfinished. And Thomas Hastings complained about that because there's, in the foundation, when you're walking up to the front of the building, there's an outline of what looks like an arch type thing. Comes out and then has like a kind of circular inside where I think the statue of Menendez, yes.
Pedro. Yes.
Is there. Anyway, there was supposed to be this elaborate arcade that was like way Gilded Age, much more fancy than the entrance that's there now. Flagler pulled the construction crew off of the Alcazar and moved them to this building so that they could be done within a year. If you get down into the nitty-gritty details, there's no telling. The records are just not there. There's not a lot in the Flagler Museum about the church. And a lot of those records are just lost. So we don't know really a honest, true number of the workers, but we do know that they didn't work day and night because in the article that I found about the crash in the middle of the night, there were no workers around. So that goes to tell you they probably weren't here working at night. But they did know what they were doing. They could work fast. They got the walls up. They got the interior done pretty quickly because they had already built 2 buildings out of the poured concrete.
Actually 3. 1,100, in William Keenan's biography, he states that there were 1,100 what would be black workers, some of the first skilled labor for blacks in the South after the Civil War, were building the ponds. Keep in mind, at the same time that is going on, literally the walkway leads to Grace Methodist. So they were working on both buildings there at exactly the same time. Both of them were finished at the same time. Grace Methodist's opens January 1st of 1888. Henry has a party for his friends for 80 people at the Ponce, January 10th, and then the 12th you have 500 people eat in the dining hall. And so they're doing those. Alcazar's underway, and then this. So those guys were pretty skilled laborers, and then Flagler brought in artisans from all over Europe to do fine craftsman work, and you had the wood carving from Potier and Stymus and the interiors and all that. So that it was a team of people that worked on all of
Constantly
them.
moving,
Yes.
constantly going. And that would have been really exciting for St. Augustine at that time.
I wish we had some
Because,
virtual way to
You know.
depict all that
And
movement.
it was the
It'd
first
be
time a lot
exciting.
of these people saw electricity
Yeah.
when the Ponce
Oh.
was opened. I can't imagine what kind of fright and anxiety they had about that.
4,000 electric light bulbs, according to the Edison General Electric
Yeah.
Company.
We all, the hook is about to drag me off stage, but we'll stick around, but we want to get out so that we can, actually worship. But thank you for coming. We appreciate it, and thanks to those who are joining us online. And thank you, Dr. Keys.
And I
for-
apologize for the microphone moving around, as usual.
But thank you so much.
Thank you, guys. Thank you very much.